February 1943. A German Field Marshal kneels in the snow and surrenders his army. The first time in the history of the German military that a Field Marshal has ever done so. Behind him, what remains of Hitler's mightiest force, starving, frostbitten, and beaten not by superior weapons, but by a city, a winter, and a single word from Berlin: never retreat. This is the story of how Adolf Hitler lost Stalingrad, and possibly the war. It began with oil. By the summer of 1942, Germany's war machine was running dry. Hitler's solution was Case Blue, a massive offensive south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. Stalingrad was never the real target. It was meant to be a flank guard, a city to secure, while the real prize lay further south. But Hitler made a fatal decision. He split his forces. Army Group South divided in two, one heading for the oil, one heading for Stalingrad. Neither force was strong enough to guarantee success alone. And Stalingrad carried a name Hitler couldn't resist. Taking Stalin's city wasn't just strategy anymore. It was ego. By late August, the German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, reached the city's outskirts. On August 23rd, the Luftwaffe unleashed one of the most devastating bombing raids of the war, reducing much of Stalingrad to rubble in a single day. It looked like a decisive blow. It was actually a mistake. The ruins gave Soviet defenders exactly what they needed: cover. Collapsed buildings, twisted rail yards, and shattered factories turned the city into a maze. One where Germany's greatest advantages, tanks and air power, suddenly meant far less. What followed, German soldiers called Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. Fighting for a single staircase could take days. A factory floor could change hands a dozen times in an afternoon. Soviet commander Vasily Chuikov gave his troops a simple, brutal order: stay as close to the German lines as possible, sometimes just meters away. It meant Luftwaffe pilots couldn't bomb the Soviets without hitting their own men. It meant German artillery, so devastating in open country, became almost useless. One apartment block, later known as Pavlov's house, was held by a handful of Soviet soldiers for nearly 2 months. Snipers turned the ruins into killing fields. The city that was supposed to fall in days became a grinder, consuming entire German divisions block by block, room by room. While the infantry bled in the streets, a quieter crisis was building behind the front lines. Stalingrad sat nearly 2,000 kilometers from Germany's factories. Every shell, every liter of fuel, every winter coat had to travel that entire distance, by rail, then by truck, over roads that turned to mud in autumn and ice in winter. The Soviets, by contrast, were fighting on home soil, with railways feeding reinforcements directly into the city. As autumn turned to winter, German trucks broke down. Horses died in the cold. Fuel convoys stalled for lack of fuel. The same overextension that had crippled Napoleon's invasion of Russia over a century earlier was quietly repeating itself. Germany's army was strong at the front, but its supply lines were stretched to breaking. Then, on November 19th, 1942, the Soviets struck, not at the exhausted German Sixth Army directly, but at its flanks, held by poorly equipped Romanian and Hungarian divisions. Within 4 days, 2 Soviet pincers met west of the city, slamming shut around nearly 300,000 Axis troops. The operation was called Uranus. The Sixth Army, Hitler's finest, was now trapped in a pocket. The Germans called the Kessel, the cauldron. Paulus requested permission to break out while there was still a chance. From Berlin, the answer came back immediately. Hitler declared Stalingrad a fortress. Retreat was forbidden. Instead, Hermann Göring promised the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped army by air. 500 tons of food, fuel, and ammunition every single day. It was a promise built on nothing. Winter storms grounded transport planes. Soviet fighters shot down hundreds more. On its best days, the airlift delivered barely a fifth of what was needed. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched a relief operation to break through to the pocket. His tanks came within 30 miles of the trapped army, and then Soviet counterattacks stopped them cold. The Sixth Army was on its own. Through December and January, the men inside the Kessel starved. Horses were eaten. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, entire limbs. Ammunition ran out faster than it could be dropped from the sky. On January 30th, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. The message was clear. Die, don't surrender. Paulus surrendered anyway, 3 days later. Roughly 90,000 German soldiers were marched into Soviet captivity. Fewer than 6,000 would ever see Germany again. In total, the Axis lost close to 1 million men in the Stalingrad campaign. Killed, wounded, captured. It was the single greatest defeat in German military history to that point, and it broke the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility. Hitler had lost an entire army, not to a stronger enemy, but to overreach, to a city that refused to fall quietly, and to his own refusal to admit defeat in time. Stalingrad didn't just cost Germany an army. It cost them the initiative on the Eastern Front, and arguably, the war.